This podcast is proudly supported in part by Different Drop, online wine retailers specialising in Australian wines of authenticity, provenance and innovation. If you go to the Different Drop website, what you're going to find is a whole range of different wines produced by generally small batch, artisan, a lot of times sustainable winemakers around Australia that you're not really going to find in a lot of the big chain retail stores because they have been lovingly sourced and researched by the guys to actually introduce the audience to new wines, exciting wines, dynamic wines made by some real up-and-coming winemakers around the country. It's really easy to find stuff, like if you want to find particular wines based on grape variety or region, wine style, it's really, really, really easy. And they proudly support the podcast by setting up a little secret section for listeners of the podcast to actually find some special packs that you're not going to find in the rest of the website. So if you go to differentdrop.com/intrepidwino, you'll be led to a special section. And then if you put in the special code intrepidwino at purchase, then the guys at Different Drop are going to look after you a little bit more. But the kind of wines you find on the website don't last for very long. So I do suggest going there and securing some wines made by previous and future guests of this very podcast. So thanks guys for supporting the podcast, and thank you Different Drop for your support of these great Australian wines. On episode 63 of the Vincast, I chat with Jeni Port, one of the most respected wine communicators in Australia. In fact, the 2014 Wine Communicators of Australia Communicator of the Year. Someone who's been writing for The Age for almost 30 years and has a wealth of knowledge and experience about Australian wine. Hello there, Vincasters, and welcome to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Authentic Wine Chat. I've got a really, really exciting guest, someone I've wanted to have on for a long, long time. But before we get to that, if you haven't yet visited the Intrepid Wino channel on YouTube, you probably have missed some little tasting videos I've been doing under the name Let's Taste. But you might have also missed the first two Let's Taste live videos. I've come up with this really crazy concept to actually have a guest on and live stream via YouTube a little tasting, so people can actually watch and ask questions and make comments and even taste along with us. So if you missed it, this past Wednesday evening, I had the guys from Unicozello, Brendan and Laura Carter, who were in Melbourne for the past week, and they showed me some of the new release white wines from their vintage 2015, which was really, really exciting. So if you want to get involved on a live stream, I've got one coming up this Monday on the 17th of August at 6 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. Previous guest of the podcast, Gary Mills, will be showing his Jamshed 2013 single vineyard wines to me. So if you want, see if you can go and secure the wines. You can buy them at differentdrop.com/intrepidwino if you want to. Open up the wines, have some friends over if you want to, and you can actually taste the wines with us and make your own comments, ask some questions. It's really, it's a crazy idea. I'm still trying it out. I'm still knocking out the kinks, but it's really fun to do, and I hope you guys will get involved. Now, for this episode, as I mentioned, Jeni Port is one of the most respected wine writers, wine communicators in Australia, and has been instrumental in effecting a lot of change in the Australian wine industry. She's obviously a big advocate for more women involved in wine, something that's a bit of a hot topic at the moment. And so she shared her experiences, she shared her philosophies a little bit, and she also shared with me her love of the Western Bulldogs, which is a team very close to my heart. But I hope you enjoy the episode. Stay tuned for the wrap-up. I'll see you on the other side. Jenny, thank you so much for making some time to be on the Vincast, and welcome.
Thank you. Absolute pleasure to be here.
And I usually start every episode asking my guest if they remember what the first interaction was with wine that kind of made you sort of stand up or sit up and take notice and think, oh, this might be something I could do.
I remember quite distinctly. It's why I'm in wine. I was about 9 years old.
Really?
And my aunt had an Irish Catholic background, and she had no children. I used to stay with her at the odd weekend, and she would buy the two of us a bottle of Barossa Pearl. And we would share it, me at 9 years old, sharing it on a Saturday night.
I've only heard stories of Barossa Pearl, but was it a sort of a sweet, bubbly
It was
wine?
quite sweet.
Yeah.
It wasn't a Method Champenoise style, and they've just brought it back, which I think is fabulous. It's only been around the last 12 to 18 months in the same original label that they had back then.
What about Benin Moselle?
Yeah, that's all right.
Okay.
And that only recently was
Porphyry?
dropped. No, I think Barossa Pearl was better than Porphyry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it kind of like what Moscato is?
I suppose.
In a way?
I think so. It was very fruity, so I suppose, there's similarities there. Barossa Pearl was launched for the 1956 Olympics, It is an Australian version of a sparkling kind of sect, I suppose. Very fruity, and I love the taste. And
lower alcohol?
I think so. Although these days, I think it's around 9 to 11.
Yeah, okay.
For a 9-year-old, I think it was part of the alcohol, but I love the grapiness.
Sure.
I loved it, and that was it.
Okay. And at what point did you kind of, like, later on sort of think, like, wine could be a career path or something that you'd like
I never thought of wine as a career path.
Okay.
Journalism is the career path that I always wanted, and that's the one that I pursue.
So how did you get into journalism? Or interested in journalism?
I always wanted to do it, so after I finished secondary school, college as they call it these days, I went to RMIT to do the journalism course there.
You're from Melbourne originally?
Yeah, yeah. And for the first year I didn't have a job, and one of the half-year assignments was doing a big, lengthy piece on cyclone that had just gone through Darwin, Cyclone Tracy.
Yeah, okay.
And so I went down to see the Chief of Staff at the Sun News Pictorial, Peter Livingston, and he was just handing out press releases because all the kids were going in there and asking for information about what had happened during that time. And I said, no, I don't want a press release, I want to talk to you. And so I sat there and I had a chat to him, and I found out that on that day, which was, New Year's Day, or no, Christmas Day or Christmas Eve, no, Christmas Day, wasn't it? That he had two reporters on. They were husband and wife. He sent the husband. And I said, why didn't you send the wife, Alison Brower? And he said, well, it was going to be a tough environment. And I quizzed him on that, and I think he actually appreciated that. So through that interview, I got a job.
Oh, wow.
And so I was 10 years at the Sun News Pictorial, and I started the wine column there as well.
So what sort of journalism, what sort of reporting were you doing to begin with?
Just general. As a cadet,
Just
you do
general
everything.
News? Yeah,
general. You do courts. I did a couple of years, felt like, of courts. You do captions. You go on around to see what it is that you might like to do. And then I ended up in the women's section, as it was back then.
The women's section. So what content was being put into the women's section?
It was women's issues.
Okay.
Which is still very important.
Sure.
But it was also food.
So it wasn't like lifestyle sort of stuff necessarily?
What you might call lifestyle. It did have knitting patterns.
Okay.
So, but it was definitely aimed at our female audience. And the lady before me who went to the Age was Rita Ehrlich. And so I filled her shoes. She went to do the Age Good Food Guide. She's very well known in the Epicure history there.
Familiar, yeah.
And she was writing a food, so I did food, but then I liked more the wine side, so I started the wine column. And they didn't want a wine column back then because they said Mr. and Mrs. Mooney Ponds, and I do quote them. My editors at the time said that they weren't interested in wine.
Okay.
Their readership was not that kind of.
They weren't interested, or they didn't drink wine?
Bit of both.
Okay.
Wine back then, and I'm talking about the 70s,
Sure.
was still pretty new.
Yeah.
The Age Epicure section was doing well, but they were targeting at that stage, and probably still do to a degree, the top 10% of what we would regard as serious wine drinkers.
Right.
And the Sun didn't want to compete there. But
Okay.
I disagreed, so I started it.
So, as far as sort of food writing and stuff like that, did you did a little bit of that to begin
Only a
with?
little.
Yeah.
Only a very little.
We
I did women's issues. I did, writing on.
Were you into
features.
food much? Did you dine much?
Yeah.
Were you in your
Wine
kind of
was so
personal
much more
life?
interesting.
Yeah. Okay. So how did you kind of you got into wine before you to sort of start a wine column? You would have had some experience with it. What was your your experience with wine before you started it? Like, did you sort of
Drinking
do it socially?
a lot.
Just drinking a lot. What was some of the kind of the favourite wines as a young adult?
Oh dear. Well, just starting out, Mateus Rosé.
Right.
Had to be.
Change the wine world.
Wolf-Blass Riesling,
Yeah.
which was the number one selling white wine in Australia for at least 4 or 5 years. Benin, all those names that now kind of appear well down history and very few drinkers today are aware of. But when I was first starting wine, Riesling was huge, and so was Cabernet.
Did they? Well, I know that when I started at Liquorland, my then boss, my manager, had been working in hospitality and retail for years. He still referred to it as Rhine Riesling.
Yeah.
And I was like, what?
Well, that was the
firstly,
issue.
What's Rhine, and then what's Rhine Riesling?
It's a very long story, but the basic story is that the Australian wine industry allowed Riesling to be both a generic and a variety, or varietal.
Yeah.
So that if you put Riesling on your label, it could be Riesling, or it could be a blend of Riesling and something else, or it could be other grape varieties. Back then, if you were buying a wine cask that had Riesling on it, it would be Sultana.
Yeah, or Muscat Gouda.
Yeah, all those.
Stuff, yeah.
No Riesling in it, because it was a generic term. And the big companies back then wanted it as a generic term because they were selling a lot of cheap wine and cask wine under the Riesling name.
And it sounded a bit more premium than putting Sultana on it.
It certainly did. So then the people said, well, if I've got the real Riesling, I will call mine Rhine Riesling to kind of differ.
Sure.
But the trouble is, then people were also taking Rhine Riesling and abusing it.
Yes.
And then right towards the time when they actually divided it and got a bit of common sense into the whole debate, you had, I remember Mount Annam was the first, said, well, I grow Riesling, I'm putting Riesling on my bottle, on my label, and I don't care. People will understand, people who know will know that it's the Riesling grape that I am promoting in my wine.
Right.
It's not a generic. And that started the debate, and eventually they woke up to themselves. So the term Riesling as a generic was dropped.
And that was about that time that, Australia started to get more success, both in Australia but also in the some of the export markets, particularly UK, where they started to label the grape varieties. And it was that.
Yeah, and it couldn't be exported as Rhine Riesling.
No.
And that brought that
exported
whole...
sparkling Burgundy or Moselle.
Champagne.
Yeah, of course.
And that was actually part of that whole impetus that changed the rules, because the Europeans said, you can't sell this wine with champagne on the label, you can't sell it with Rhine on the label, you can't sell it as Chablis on the label, which is what they were all labelled back then. And then the Australians had to sit down with the Europeans and come to an agreement, because the Europeans were putting massive tariffs on our wines so that they wouldn't sell.
Yeah.
They were teaching them a lesson. And the lesson was learnt, and they sat down, and that was the Australia-EU trade agreement, which we are now looking at. That's what is part of our whole labelling, our whole label integrity program is all part of that original meeting.
Is that when they established the sort of labelling laws as far as it has to be 85% or would have...
No, that wasn't part of it. Okay. That was, the Australians gave up the use of the words champagne, chablis, geographical terms.
Yes.
That were geographical places in Europe.
Yeah.
They gave those up. The Europeans were very grateful. They dropped their tariffs. They made it more accessible for Australian wines to have European market. Mm-hmm. And the Europeans turned around and said, well, you have protected our geographical boundaries. We want to protect yours so that in the future you don't have what we had to suffer. You don't have a Barossa Shiraz coming from the Napa Valley. And so Australians came back, and that was about 1984, and they spent 12 years working out all of their wine boundaries.
The geographic indicators.
Yeah. And that is a direct response from that Australia-EU trade agreement.
Sure.
And so the label integrity program is added onto that as well.
Right. So as far as wine communications back then, what did they kind of form? Were there many guides? There were some articles in places like Epicure? Were there wine periodicals or magazines?
Oh, yeah. Perhaps not as many as today. Len Evans, of course, was in the Australian.
Sure.
He was one of the pioneers in print. Dan Murphy was the first age wine writer. He wrote a number of books, including a fascinating classification of Australian wines.
Oh.
So he early on thought there should be some form of classification.
So classification in the sense of, like, this is a wine of quality, not necessarily
a bit like a
this
Langton's.
Vintage I give at this point. Okay, yeah.
Think of a Langton's classification.
Or the classification of, appellations and crus sort of thing. Less so.
No, I think more of a Langton's, more on reputation history, tasting history. Yeah. And that was always fascinating. Well, who else? There were a few. There were books. Journey to Victorian wine. There were a number of books around. And then James Halliday was still coming through, emerging at that time. I've got his early books. He did guides to Victoria, South Australia, New South Wales. And he had a classification system too. It was AA or AB. One was the quality, and there was two parts to his judging. Yeah.
So your decision to sort of, force the issue, as it were, to get some space for wine
in the women's section.
In the women's section.
That's why no one noticed. The editor didn't care. He never read the women's section.
Oh, there you go. What were you hoping to sort of gain out of that? Was it just about sort of saying, hey, let's just talk about wine, or education, or interest? Was it sort of just form part of the women's issues sort of thing?
No, although the first story I wrote was Women in Wine.
Oh.
But no, I'm a journalist, and my interest is always in what's news and telling a story.
Yeah, okay.
Always.
Do you remember what your first sort of piece was?
Women in Wine.
Okay.
Yeah.
What as far as like women winemakers? Or...
Yeah.
Okay.
Back then there weren't very many. I'm talking about, 79, 78, 79, 80. Ursula Pridham was one I remember. There were a few around, but not very many. It was still kind of interesting to and people didn't know, so I did a story on them.
Were you mostly writing about Australian wine?
Yeah, back then. I do remember that then, as today, that we had a lot of champagne producers coming through, especially around October, November. So I was doing a lot on champagne. But it was a bit like what we do today. Someone visits, you go out and meet them, have a chat to them, taste their wine. It was also the start of the Wine Press Club
Okay.
That was starting around that time. I ended up on the committee and then I became president. And we were always getting fabulous speakers, always. So there was generally a really good story in there. Especially I remember one time we had Wolf Blass after he'd just sold his wine company to Muldara. And that was a very kind of, I won't say volatile, but there was a lot of discussion when he addressed us.
Early on, did you kind of have to go and seek the story out, or I mean, obviously now there's press releases that come out, and they're like producers sort of talk about doing an event.
I will always argue. I don't rely on press releases.
No.
But
that's good, of course. But I'm just
no
wondering,
one can rely on press releases.
If there were press releases relating to wine at that time, or did you have to sort of seek the story out yourself completely?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're the ones I like. I like stories that others don't get.
Sure.
I mean, the whole idea in journalism is to be first.
Mm-hmm.
There are no prizes for second. To find something that you have that no one else has, I find great enjoyment in doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, if it's news, that's fine, but you've got to get it first, or hopefully. Press releases, they're okay. They can give you information, and sometimes they will give you the germ of a story, but if you relied on press releases, you're not a journalist. I'm sorry.
Of course. What were some of the early experiences as far as going and visiting wine producers and vineyards?
Well, that was the best fun. Still is.
Yeah.
Well, I used to take all my holidays, still do, to a large degree in wine regions.
Yeah.
So, go up to the Rutherglen. I went to the Barossa Valley before I went anywhere else. I spent a lot of time in the Barossa before I even went up to Rutherglen, and then
trying to find
Central
where Barossa Pearl was coming from?
No, I got to say, at that time, I really liked the Riesling from Barossa, still do, and Sem, and some of the early Grenache coming through, I really enjoyed. No, I was just, when you're that young and keen, you're just a sponge. You just want to try everything.
Yeah.
And I love the fortifieds from the Barossa, and it's
one of the best visits of my entire life was going to Seppeltsfield and sort of seeing that room with all that para.
Absolutely magic. And to see fortifieds go into a bit of a spiral, downward spiral, is it's very sad because it's forced a lot of producers to move out of fortified since they can't sell them. It's forced a lot of winemakers to not even think about becoming or have any interest in fortified winemaking. I believe that has then led to education colleges no longer offering it as a mainstream subject for winemakers. So it has these terrible effects that that just roll on from the fact that we're not drinking as much or even thinking about it as much. But again, I was there on that cusp where I used to drink a lot of fortifieds. All of my friends did. And the thing that killed a flap was 0.05.
Yeah.
It was the last thing you had at dinner, whether it was in a restaurant or in at a home, and then you'd get in your car and you'd drive, and then after 0.05 it was the first thing you cut off. And I'm not saying that I don't like 0.05. It was a fabulous introduction that had taught us more about the consumption of alcohol and what we do when we get behind a wheel. No problem with that, but it was the single biggest killer of the fortified wine market.
Hopefully people are drinking less but drinking better.
I hope so.
So at what point did you sort of move on from the Sun? Was it before or after it kind of merged with the Herald?
Just before.
Okay.
So I had my first child and I left the Sun, and about 2 years later it merged with, under Murdoch, they merged the Sun and the Herald together. Mine was the morning paper, merged it with the afternoon paper, but I went straight to the Age.
Okay.
Epicure.
And you've sort of been there ever since. It's a few years now?
29.
Wow.
Yeah.
Far out. Did you start in Epicure, or there were some other At the time, were there other spots for wine?
Nope.
No?
That was it.
That was it.
Yeah. I'm trying to think who was there. I don't think Mark Shield had come on yet. He came a little bit later. Sarah Goff was there before me, I think, or there with me for a while, and then she left to go to Brown Brothers as their PR. E. Mackay, he was there. He was the wine writer.
Okay.
But the Age, until recently, has always employed at least 3 wine writers, sometimes 4. And I always found that absolutely amazing. I don't know of any other metropolitan newspaper in the world that has employed 4 wine writers at one time.
That's pretty amazing. Was there, at that time, there was weekly sort of wine reviews and stuff like that?
Yeah, it was a broadsheet back then.
Okay.
So we had a lot of space and we ran really good stories. Quite long, involved stories. And some of them were tasting notes, but tasting notes weren't really big back then, I've got to say. Not like they are now. It was telling people more about, in the form of a long read, I suppose. What we now might consider a long read.
Tell me, what were some of the articles that you remember being really super proud of, and some of the stories that you shared with an audience?
Well, we did a lot on liquor licensing back then.
Okay.
It was just coming up to the time when the state government was looking at an overhaul of liquor licensing reforms, or the bills at that time. And I think because of not just the stories I wrote, but the stories that the Age did pursue, that it did help them to employ John Neuenhausen to do his Neuenhausen report. And that report, the findings of it, were largely taken up in the liquor licence bill, the reforms that came through in, what would it be, early 90s, I suppose. So I was really proud of that. But I can't say that I alone was responsible for that. But it was good to, that's part of journalism too, to actually do something to change society for the better.
Sure.
And I think it did. Up until then, you had a lot of BYOs. That licensed was quite restrictive. It was very hard to get restaurant bar licenses because of the power of the hotel groups, Australian Hotel Association. They were very powerful.
I still couldn't quite work out why, like, a selling point was, we are licensed. It's like, is that a good thing? I don't get it. But it wasn't until much later that I understood, that's what it means, and that's why it's kind of important.
And just the flexibility, you could not have a glass of wine by itself. It had to be with a meal. And that was a breakthrough for me, I think, and the breakthrough for Victoria in Australia, because we were among the first. The ACT was the first, but we were around the second to have this thorough reform of liquor licensing, so that you could sit outside, have a glass of wine with no food, and act like a responsible adult, and enjoy what John Neuenhausen always said was this more Mediterranean lifestyle.
Of course.
And he foresaw the closing of those beer barns and the creation, which we have now, of smaller wine bars, suburban wine bars. So you didn't get in your car and drive to a beer barn 20 miles away and drink a skinful and then drive home. His idea was, and he got it from looking just what you did in Italy, was walking to your local wine bar, having a glass or two, having some food, walking back home. And it was part of the food and the wine and a more community proper appreciation and education of alcohol.
And a culture around it.
Yeah.
Now it's time for just a quick mid-episode break to mention another supporter of this podcast. Guys, have you ever gone shopping for glassware and thought that there were too many different shapes, one for every conceivable style and variety you can imagine, and thought, couldn't it be a bit easier than this? Well, the guys at Plum Glassware thought exactly the same thing, and they did a lot of research to determine that realistically you only need a couple of shapes, and that's going to cover all your needs. And, for white wine, you need 2 shapes. Red wine, you need 2 shapes. shapes. Basically, one for aromatic and one for complex wines, and then a flute. So you can cover everything you might need with just 5 glasses. If you go to plum.com, you're going to find a lot of information, the story about Plum. You'll find information about the crystal itself. And you'll also be able to subscribe to their kind of mailing list and get an introductory offer. You'll get $120 worth of glassware for $35 plus a $35 voucher off your next purchase over $60. And if you do go there, please let them know that you were sent there by the Intrepid Wino. And thank you guys for your support of this podcast. So where did the kind of the tasting note and the scoring, or a rating of a wine sort of come on board, do you think?
Oh, I know when it came on board. It was after Robert Parker.
Right. Okay. So was it? Did Robert Parker have sort of resonance here in Australia?
Oh yes.
Okay. Wow.
Oh yes, in the Barossa Valley in particular.
Sure.
And so what we had for a while there was he would come over. Not that he came over that often, but he would come over. Or wines, he had a distributor in the US who would have the wines and then send it to him. And he would review them, and there were a number of wines that got high scores. And so the producers here used that as leverage to get into wine lists and wine shelves. And that had this roll-on effect that it was around that same time too where Australia realised that it was part of a global world, I suppose, that we were no longer that isolated, that we had wine companies coming here from overseas and gobbling other wine companies up. People were in the US, in Europe, were talking about Australian wines. They were coming here and we were going there. It just became a much smaller wine world. And part of that was Robert Parker making it smaller from that point of view. It was a bit slow here to resonate, but because it resonated in America particularly, I remember I did one story where there were a few sommeliers who were taking their allocation of some particular winemakers from the Barossa and selling it into the US market to...
local sommeliers selling
yeah,
it? Oh, my God.
Yeah, and... some of the producers didn't like that,
it's a bit cheeky.
Yes, it was. So they alerted me, and I wrote a story about it. And I think it kind of stopped rather suddenly. But the US market wanted all these wines, and suddenly we were on allocation here, and we're going, well, what is all this about? And so the whole Robert Parker phenomenon arrived, and that's when Australian wine writers said, well, do we get on this bus or don't we? And a number held out. But one of the first to go was James, because he realised there was a global market for his scores, his books on Australian wine. So James Halliday was among the first.
So he was thinking not necessarily exclusively for an Australian audience; it was a global audience who craved, a tasting note and a rating.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was a way to kind of compete with Robert Parker, if you like.
Sure.
Because he had all of his notes on Australian wine, far more comprehensive than Parker could ever do. And so what he had to do, though, was, and what all wine writers who have a 100-point system have used, and no one points it out, is that Halliday adapted his a little bit differently to Parker's system. And it's generally around the 94, 90, 95, 96 mark where they changed their scores. So he had his own James Halliday 100-point system.
Okay.
And then the next was Jeremy Oliver.
Yeah.
And he went into quite an involved process. You should talk to him about it sometime, about how he came to the 100-point system. He tried a mathematical way of looking at the 20-point system, which we were all using, especially in show judging, converting that 20-point into a 100-point. And so his, again, is a very different individual 100-point system to James. And then slowly other wine writers got on board too.
So were they in guides, or was this in sort of articles and stuff like that?
James did it in his books, and Jeremy did it in his books.
Right.
And then around that time, of course, we have the start of blogs.
Okay.
So you've got to see it in a kind of historical sense.
Sure.
That one almost begets the other. That around that time, everyone's talking about scores, and of course, Parker had moved from the Wine Advocate in a newspaper magazine format into online, and then everyone else was going online. So all of your tasting notes online, you could then just put a score in. And then in books, and then it just went from that into magazines and slowly into papers. I think newspapers were the last to really get on board. But this is my point, which gets me quite frustrated. And as a consumer, I can't imagine how people can understand it. Everyone thinks there's only one 100-point system.
Sure.
And each one is different. And unless they put a guide to how they approach what is outstanding, what is great, what is good, that kind of thing. And even those terms can change. You don't know. Everyone goes, well, it's got to be 90 and above. But even within 90 to 100, there's still a lot of difference. Compare a number of 100-point systems and just see the difference.
That would be interesting to write a piece on that. Now, you mentioned show judging. Did you get the opportunity to do much show judging?
I do a little.
Right.
I'm a non-technical wine judge. I'm not trained as a winemaker. So for years, I was an associate. The winemakers were the judges, and I was an associate. And then around that time, there was an overhaul of the wine show system too, where they said, well, we need people who represent consumers, that winemakers are all very well, that they've got technical knowledge. But we would like people to balance the judging panels and have those that are sommeliers, wine writers, those who don't have, in many cases, wine training, but are dealing with wine every day and can give a consumer viewpoint. And so, I graduated to judge status.
Did you find that interesting as far as how the wine media, wine judge and that kind of thing was starting to think more about the consumer rather than... Because I think that I did actually an episode quite some time ago talking about wine shows and how the idea was to improve quality, as far as establishing what breed, I guess, is, or what quality is for variety and region, that kind of thing. Do you think it's interesting that is thinking more, okay, now it's about consumer and it's about, educating them about what is quality and what is provenance and what is quality of this sort of variety?
I think wine shows have changed in a number of ways, and one of them is that, yes, instead of improving the breed, which is what it was always about originally, and that was getting winemakers in at the exhibitor tasting and having a chat to them about why their wine was faulty or why it got 14 points or why it got 18 points. And then it slowly evolved into, let's talk about the consumer, and that's where I came in, because I only write for consumers, and I am a consumer myself.
Of course.
And then I could see that they then brought in consumers. And even now, we're talking about, just lately, not even having those big fancy wine show dinners, and everyone clapping each other on the back, that to open up in a more practical way to consumers. And that's where this second thing has come in, which can be a good thing or not. And that is where wine shows are now selling their wine, the wines that do well. I'm not sure about that myself. I think that is outside their boundaries for me. I don't want them selling wines, promoting the wines that do well.
So you mean like the wine show as a brand?
Right. There are a number of wine shows. They will tie in with a retailer, and those wines that do well at the end will then be part of a dozen, or the gold medal white wine dozen, or I don't know how they actually promote it.
Wow, to be honest, I'm sort of so out of the loop as far as wine shows. I didn't even know that kind of thing was going on.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
And then you have sponsors. Dan Murphy's does come to mind. and they will sponsor a number of wine shows, and then part of their deal is that the wines do well in that wine show will then be bought by Dan Murphy's to promote in a similar vein. And you have had some winemakers say, well, I've done well in X wine show, but to tell you the truth, I don't necessarily want to go through Dan Murphy's.
Sure.
I have my own avenues for sales.
Sure.
It's muddying the waters from my point of view. I can understand they're saying, well, this is that next leap from wine shows, that it's not about winemakers and it's not about the industry, it's about consumers.
Yeah. And I would argue that there are synergies involved with that, but then you have to think that, come on, there must be some conflict of interest at some point.
I don't even know about conflict of interest. I just don't feel right being involved in something that then becomes a commercial money-making exercise.
Sure.
I don't know. I like things straight and simple and transparent.
Sure. How did you find sort of the advent of more online space and social media? You know, of course, you're someone that I follow and regularly enjoy your tweeting, for example, particularly as we're both Western Bulldogs supporters.
Yeah.
And it's always
Go Dogs.
Yes.
Yeah.
Have you found that has changed communication as far as
I
wine?
love it. For a while there, we had these wine writers who thought that they were gods. And Robert Parker was part of that phenomenon, I think.
Sure.
And that's where scores got so out of control, where you'd give a wine 98. Not that I ever gave scores, and I don't do scores, but, you know, you'd give a wine 98, and then you would sit back and just, you know, wait for the ka-chings as, you know, the maker of that wine sold out. And you could feel rather pleased with yourself that, you know, that you'd done that and all that kind of stupid nonsense. I don't like that. And I don't like people feeling that they have a monopoly on information. And I think that was the great thing about the explosion of social media and blogs. I do like that. I do like that whole diversification. My only issue is, again, it's that whole question of transparency. And I work under a number of codes of ethics. And I have concerns that a number of bloggers don't. It's a bit of a Wild West to a degree. I'm sure it all gets sorted out.
I think that in Australia, in my opinion, wine blogging is still not a big thing, not like food blogging, for example. And I think there's still not as much scrutiny on that sort of thing. There could be more, but I don't know. Tell me what you think. Do you think wine blogging? Are people, as far as the consumers, as far as is there a readership getting behind wine blogging as opposed to sort of just wine social media?
Oh yeah, I think so. I mean, all you got to do is look at the Wine Idealist. I think he's doing fabulous stuff.
Former guest of the podcast.
Oh, well, there are some that do it so well.
Sure.
And then there are others, and I don't want that whole medium to be counterproductive.
Sure.
I would like for, I suppose, as I said, maybe it all gets sorted out, that the poor performers, those that are taking money to write up reviews, that aren't necessarily letting people know that they're being paid, that they will be found out, and they possibly will. And maybe I am just exaggerating my concerns about it, but that would be my main concern. It is a
concern, of course. You know, if you're not employed by a media organisation where you're expected to follow a code of ethics, a code of conduct, the potential for that to be taken advantage of course, is pretty significant.
Well, I think in food blogging, I don't know whether you'll ever get to this in wine, but you certainly have appearance fees.
Yeah.
A number of the top bloggers are being offered money to appear at functions and to kind of... That to me is not very transparent. That to me is
that's sort of buying into that
questionable.
the MasterChef phenomenon as well. It's interesting, but I think that's probably another topic.
Yeah.
As far as other writing or comms, apart from your work with Epicure, are you doing much writing elsewhere?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
James Halliday's Wine Companion magazine,
Okay.
which is doing some nice stuff. They're, with magazines, you have to have a certain little market niche that you're looking at, and I think they do theirs well.
Yep.
I've always written for Winestate many, many years.
Peter.
Yeah, Gourmet Traveller Wine.
Mm-hmm.
Love Gourmet Traveller. Wine Selector. What else? Oh, I write for Il Tridente, which is a Maserati magazine.
Okay.
That's nice.
I do like Maseratis.
So do I. And Mightygo Wine Business International, which is based in Germany. They do fascinating stuff. It's more business orientated.
And are they kind of giving you stuff, or are you pitching stuff to them?
Yeah.
So how does that work? You've got a range of different stories you're working on, you have worked on, and
Well, you've got to know what your market is, what your magazine is,
Sure.
And so hopefully I don't get that many pictures knocked back.
I should hope not at this point.
Well, yeah, you should know what you're doing by now, you
Sure.
think. Not all of them are, but yeah, it's... People go, oh, where are your ideas from? Often people have no understanding that they go, oh, you've got to think of these story ideas all the time. There are stories everywhere. You meet people, you talk to people, you taste things. I'm out there meeting and talking and tasting all the time. Stories drop onto my lap if I can pick them up and make them interesting, readable, entertaining, informative.
And if I could get you to look into your sort of wine com crystal ball, what do you think is going to be something everyone's going to be talking about in 5 years' time?
Gee, I'd love to think it was Marsanne. It has been waning so very long.
Well, it's quite interesting that probably the best-known wine podcast, I have to admit, I'll Drink to That with Libby Dalton. He just interviewed the winery, Tabilk.
Winery of the
Winery
Year.
of the Year in the Wine Companion.
Yeah.
And he was really talking up Marsanne.
What is wrong with people out there? Why can't they see?
That's good enough for the Queen.
Yeah, look, I've been going to Tabilk, and I don't hold back on it. Tabilk is one of my favourite. I shouldn't have favourites, but I've been going there for over 30 years. And over 30 years I've been buying Marsanne. And I just don't understand why people don't get it. It's beautiful and fresh, young. And then it ages so gracefully. It's like Riesling.
Or Hunter Semillon.
Yeah. Well, the 1927 Vines was made in that style, and it's
Sure.
released with 6 years or so age.
Sure.
And it is made in that deliberately different style. And interestingly, it will only get released if it gets a trophy. And it always gets trophies. And I have judged it where it has got a trophy. But it's just such a damn good wine.
Yeah.
And they age it themselves and they release it too. How many producers do that, especially with a white wine?
If anyone thinks of Marsanne, particularly, from Tabilk, as daggy, you need to get over it, because it is such an undervalued wine. It is a dead set bargain.
You can see it through, the whole prism of age. That's what I love. Get it when it's just released. You get that lovely honeysuckle jasmine character coming up. And then you just watch that toast develop and that honey come in. And then, it can be so glorious.
Well, I'll tell you what, I think I might have to do a little, I've started doing some little YouTube tastings. I might have to do one on some young and some old Tabilk. I might see if I can secure some bottles. But Thank you very much, Jeni. I really appreciate you
Thank you.
And sharing some of your experience and your wisdom. What are the ways, apart from the publications you mentioned, that people can follow you? Tell us your social media handles.
I only have Twitter. I
Okay.
don't have Facebook.
No?
No. I'm on Facebook to follow others.
You're a lurker.
And I don't have a blog, and I'm really quite terrible. Although I will put in a plug for my dear friend Jane Faulkner, who is launching her blog after about 3 years.
Oh my goodness.
It is this year, cross fingers, and Wine Matters, and that will be fabulous.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how can I compete with something like that? She has been working on it so long. It's going to be fabulous. But no, I'm on Twitter.
I can get her on to talk about that.
Oh.
But you are at Jeni Port on Twitter.
Yeah.
And if you're a Bulldog supporter, I insist you follow her.
Yeah.
And thank you guys for listening to another episode of the Vincast. I have been James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino. And you can follow me on social media on Twitter and Instagram. I'm at Intrepid Wino. And you can follow the podcast on Twitter at the Vincast. If you go to facebook.com/Intrepid Wino, you'll find my Facebook page where I share lots of stuff. And if you go to the YouTube channel Intrepid Wino, one word, you'll be able to find lots of different videos that I'm posting all the time, including some of the Let's Taste videos that I've mentioned. If you want to subscribe to the podcast, it's the best way to be able to download the episode as soon as it becomes live. Go to iTunes or Stitcher or Player FM or even the Podcaster app on your phone and press that subscribe button. And if you do that, please do leave a rating and review, because I love to hear from people and I would really appreciate you spreading the word about the Vincast. Of course, if you go to www.intrepidwino.com, you'll find all that information as well as every episode of the podcast, lots of different writings, all the videos, really, lots of different ways you can get in contact with me, because I would love to hear from you. I'm really excited for the next episode, and make sure you stay tuned for the Gary Mills Jam Sheet live stream tasting on Monday the 17th at 6 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. Thanks very much. Thank you to Jeni for joining me on this episode. I will see you next time. Bye.